Welcome, Soul Seekers. This is Cherie Burton and the Soul Rose Show, where ancient feminine wisdom meets the modern path of soul evolution. This also has become a podcast where we unravel the complex threads of faith and spirituality. Today, we have a very raw, very real conversation on deconstruction with the controversial and brilliant cartoonist David Hayward, commonly known as the Naked Pastor. David holds a BA in Bible and Theology, a master's in Theological Studies in the New Testament, and a Diploma of Ministry. He was ordained to the ministry and served in local churches, preaching and teaching and providing pastoral care for about 30 years. His book, Questions Are the Answer, and his cartoons inject humor into deep spiritual concepts that often carry harmful dogma. And so in this discussion, you could say we pierce to the veil on the complex process of religious deconstruction and the hunt for spiritual independence to get to the naked truth. For anyone out there feeling alone in their spiritual upheaval, this episode is a reminder of the unity found in shared experiences. Both David and I open up about our own struggles, the doubt, and the eventual emergence into kind of this clearer, more authentic spiritual path and existence. So hopefully this episode can be a guiding light for those of you navigating the murky waters of questioning the very fabric of your religious or spiritual beliefs without shame or fear. Follow me on Instagram at cherie.burton and follow David at Naked Pastor. You can also ask to join my private Facebook group, Soul Rose Community, to see some of David's cartoons and explore a little deeper about this religious deconstructing of which we talk about in this episode. Enjoy this raw conversation with the Naked Pastor, David Hayward, and I as we peel back layers and redefine what it means to be spiritually connected. Hello, David Hayward, aka Naked Pastor.
Hey, how are you?
I'm great. So you and I were kind of talking off air before we started recording. I was telling you I've had your book here. Those of you who are watching on YouTube, Questions Are the Answer, with a little bit of your background and story and some of your brilliant cartoons that, do you call them cartoons? What do you call them?
I do. I do. I
Okay.
call them cartoons. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was telling you that like the reason it's so compelling is because it's bringing in levity with such deep, eternally charged, if you will,
hmm
concepts that are just alive in the kind of collective psyche. And you
hmm
bring in this element of lightness mixed with that. And it's beautiful.
Thank you. Somebody gave me a huge compliment lately. They said cartoons are for Naked Pastor what parables were for Jesus.
Mm,
And I really love that because they're not comparing me to Jesus, but they're comparing the fact that somebody can use something so day to day and normal and mundane to illustrate some tremendous truth. So,
yeah.
yeah, I think that's really cool. I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it just lifts the weight of whatever it is. I was actually showing my sister, who I was talking to earlier. I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna have David Hayward on the Naked Pastor," and I was showing her some of your cartoons, and there's this one with these, this like bearded, bald, robed men. One of them is writing, and it says, it looks like a prophet or something. It's like, or God is writing over the prophet's shoulder as the prophet's writing, and he's saying, "Write that they were created as a second thought to be our helpers. That should shut them up."
Yeah.
I wanna go there first, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Let's
love
do
that
it.
you're an advocate for women and you've seen this patriarchal culture and you've deconstructed that. We're gonna talk about deconstruction today, but I guess I had my own sacred feminine awakening. Have you heard, I'm sure you have, of Sue Monk Kidd and the
Oh,
book
yeah.
Dance of the Dissident Daughter?
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with that?
Not that book particularly yet, though. No, but
Okay. Yeah, she wrote this incredible book about her life as a pastor's wife or some they were in the clergy somehow and she had this whole awakening and even though her religion of origin is different than mine, I really related with
mm,
some of her insights and some of the things that she had walked through in trying to
yeah,
claim her voice and power as a woman.
yeah.
Can we start there with you? Like, because I've seen a lot of your cartoons are very feminine friendly, let's just say. How has your understanding of women's roles, let's just say, let's start with the church and what you noticed, because you were a minister for a time,
Yeah.
and how that's evolved for you?
Yeah, so I think what happened to me was some point along the road, I realized that we are all one. We're all connected at a deep and fundamental level, that there's no hierarchy of value among any of us and the human race, whether it's your gender or your sexual orientation or your color. your race, your religion, your ideology, your lack of religion or whatever. To me, it was a very profound, let's call it a mystical moment where I just saw the oneness of us all, and that this necessarily translates into valuing women or valuing LGBTQ folk or valuing people of color, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just, to me, it's not like I chose to take on feminism and then I chose to take on LGBTQ plus, or I chose to take on race or anything like that. It's like we're all one. Everybody gets to play. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah,
And that's how, for me, it seems the church is drawing a line in the sand about who's in and who's out. And to me, that's fundamentally wrong. It's a fundamental
absolutely.
understanding of what love is. Yeah.
And sort of co-opting a Jesus, because I know he makes his appearance in a lot of your cartoons, which I absolutely love. Co-opting a Jesus that would put people on the margins or not include them in the greater discussions. Let's just say how things are run or what policies are.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how does the Jesus, did you always see Jesus that way, or did that have to distill on you later as your own awakening to the oneness that you're talking about?
Well, my understanding of Jesus has vastly changed over time. But like I was sharing with you maybe before the show, well, my deconstruction began on my graduation day from seminary. I was actually in my robe, getting ready to go to the ceremony, when it suddenly dawned on me, I don't think I believe in the inspiration of scripture, that it fell out of heaven as a divine document. That was the beginning. It was almost like a corrupt code was inserted into my hard drive, and it just started to do its work, slowly corrupting my theological software,
Yeah.
and eventually led to me leaving the ministry in 2010. So, that was decades. That took
That took a
decades.
while. Yeah,
Yeah.
yours is more of a slow burn than mine. My own deconstruction process and path, mine was more like a line in the sand. Although I could see how women were excluded, heavily
Mhm.
excluded and disempowered. And I wouldn't have even said that back then that I felt disempowered. But
Yeah.
that over the years, it was just the slow drip of this something's not right here. Mormonism has its own flavor of hierarchy because you spoke to, you don't believe that there's hierarchy. I certainly don't believe that now, but there was a time that I did. I really
Yeah.
believe there was a quote unquote patriarchal order, both
Mhm.
on heaven and in earth, and that this church was restoring the patriarchy to the earth, literally, as
Mhm.
as the most like divine template. And so there was no real feminine co-representation at the highest levels. And then, like, there's a prophet and 12 apostles and a quorum of the 70, and they're all men,
Yes.
wonderful men. Nonetheless, women were not given the same power and authority keys of administration or
Mhm.
visibility.
Mhm.
And I'm very young. I'm talking like 7 or 8 years old. I could see the gender disparity, but I didn't dare argue with that. That's just the
No.
way God did it.
Right. And that's what deconstruction means basically, is when you start questioning things, it's a dismantling of what we thought to be true.
Mhm.
And to me, deconstruction in any form is a healthy process. We hear the word deconstruction being used all the time now. Deconstructing the patriarchy, deconstructing gender, deconstructing capitalism, deconstructing democracy,
Right.
everybody's deconstructing something. The word's constantly being used, and basically it means dismantling, to look at the parts, to examine it in its detail and figure out which is working, which isn't working, which is good, which is bad, and what is helpful, what is not, etc. And I compare it to Marie Kondo. I don't know, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah. Mhm,
and
tidy
the
what is it? Like the joy of
Japanese, yeah,
yeah.
the Japanese minimalist who teaches us how to declutter. And I kind of like that analogy when it comes to our beliefs, where we declutter our beliefs and we keep what brings us joy, and we
Mhm.
give away, or no longer take with us or keep beliefs that are we no longer need or are harmful.
Don't you think there's something really alive, let's just say, in the Christian consciousness around suffering is more righteous versus joy?
Oh man, that's what I grew up in.
The
Totally.
martyr thing, the persecution
Oh man.
complex, like you're
Yeah.
more spiritual if you're like
Yeah.
down in the ashes in the trenches and suffering, and Jesus sacrificed for you. So you need to co-regulate that suffering that you added to that stuff, all of that.
Yeah, there's two routes you can take for Jesus. One is the health wealth route, where Jesus wants you to be healthy and wealthy and to succeed. And then the other route, and that's the whole resurrection route. Like he wants you to succeed and be victorious.
Yeah, that's like transactional gospel, isn't it too? Like if
Yeah.
you do these things,
Yeah.
Jesus will bless you with wealth and prosperity and health.
But it
Prosperity
works on the
gospel.
other side as well, where the other one is the persecuted, suffering Jesus, who ends up being crucified, dead and buried, and where you deny yourself and crucify yourself and turn the other cheek, and that whole route, and embracing poverty. So that's what I preferred.
Yeah.
And I was raised in a home that sort of conditioned me to prefer that, but that's definitely the route I chose, and had to learn to heal myself from.
Do you think that created depression for you?
No, I don't think I was, not depression. I mean, I was really into it. I mean, that whole theology and spirituality of suffering, the suffering Christ and self-denial,
Right.
and all that is very rich,
Sure. Yeah. Well, and
but
sacrifice in my theological construct was the highest thing in heaven. Obedience and sacrifice, those two things were the highest order of heaven. So the
mhm,
more that you say, like, it's kind of like that self abnegation meets you're so bad and dirty and unholy and weak, but you're so loved and cherished and full of the light and you're a child of God. Like, we don't know quite how to marry those two ways to see ourselves.
right,
And it
yeah,
creates a lot of splitting in the psyche.
mhm. Yeah, I really struggled with that. It
Yeah,
took
I
me
did
a
too.
long time to heal from that. In fact, when I left the ministry in 2010, I knew that was gonna be my number one project. I had to go to the school of life and learn how to take care of myself and think more positively and build a business and make money and promote myself and sell my art and make do books and courses and sell those and blah, 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 blah. It was a huge undertaking. It was the most difficult university I ever went to.
Mm.
And I ended up writing a book about it called Money is Spiritual. I can't believe I've written a book called that, but that's what came out of that
You
whole
know what?
story.
I went through a similar process where I decided that I wanted to create legacy wealth, let's just say, just
Mhm.
because. And also because I love the idea of contributing and having options and added resources and what have you. And it was the same thing. I had to look at, money is the root of all evil and
Yeah.
there, and also just deeper, deeper, deeper. There is a very strong undercurrent of transactional spirituality and prosperity gospel that you were
Mhm.
speaking to earlier of like, there's this track you go down if you're the Lord's special elite, chosen, holy, and he's going to bless you with riches and things. And you can read that into scripture. You can see that like he gave Abraham lands and cattle and all this inheritance. And so you start to equate your, I guess, performance,
Mhm.
spiritual performance with,
Mhm.
and so for people who are doing all the things like me, running the race and the track and going on that hamster wheel of striving and perfection and worthiness, and you're not seeing the promises that you were told you would get if you did those things, you
Right.
personalize it and say, oh gosh, I really am not worthy. I'm just not
Yeah.
worthy.
Yeah. But I experienced the same thing in the whole poverty mentality as well, the poverty spirituality, where you get this sort of understanding, and there's threads of this in scripture as well, where the more you suffer, the closer God is to you.
Yeah.
And that you're more deserving of God if you suffer more.
Right.
And it creates an upside down hierarchy. It's a
Mm,
race to the bottom. In the prosperity gospel, it's a race to the top.
mm,
In the poverty gospel, it's a race to the bottom.
mm.
But the problem is the same, just two sides of the same coin of who can claim to be closer to God.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I hadn't thought about that, but thank you for that visual. So true. See, I've lived both sides of that as well. I
Yeah.
remember when I was serving as a Mormon missionary and, putting the name tag on and knocking on the doors and stuff. I was in the Bible Belt in Texas and literally everyone hated us because Mormonism isn't a super popular brand of Christianity. Anyway, so I'm 22, I'm knocking on doors in the sweltering heat, door slam after door slam after door slam. And the way that I learned to cope with that rejection is to develop a thick skin, because the definite message that we got from our leaders was that that just means you're doing the right thing for God. It's that
Mhm.
persecution complex
Yeah.
of I can get thicker skin by people rejecting me and whatever. I didn't even think to myself, now why would they think this about Mormons? And
Mhm.
how can I meet them in that place of like, why do
Mhm.
you feel so divisive, and what do I represent to you? Now that I have done quite a bit of deconstructing, I can see why there are elements of Mormonism where people would definitely say this isn't a safe space. There were elements of it, like the history of polygamy and other things.
Mhm.
When you started to, okay, how did that flip, that upside down where the poverty, you're going down, 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 and then you're in the suffering and the kind of that martyr for Christ and however that looks.
Mhm.
How did it start to fizzle or dismantle? Like, when did you kind of awaken to maybe this isn't the best way that I can commune with God or show up in the world?
Well, like I said, when I left the ministry in 2010, I was unemployed, and I really felt unemployable because my training was solely in theology and pastoral ministry. And what good is that outside of the professional ministry? I've come to discover there's a lot of good in it, but at that time, that's the way I felt. And I knew I had to somehow do something about it myself. And because I had, up to that point, relied on God to rescue me, He wasn't showing up.
Mm,
So I really did feel like I was on my own. And this is one of the big things that happens with deconstruction is you need to learn to think and live differently. And at first, it's going to feel transgressive. And I knew that in my knower, like intuitively, I knew I'm going to feel like I'm transgressing.
mhm,
This is going to be really hard because not only do I have to learn business, but I have to get over my feelings of yuckiness for engaging in business.
mhm,
Not that business is yucky, but it was for me. For me, money and spirituality sullied each other.
mm.
And and
Like you're
and
like selling your soul or something
yes,
like that.
that's right. So that's what happens when people deconstruct this season of where you're feeling like you're transgressing, and you have to deal with those feelings and come to a place where you realize those feelings of transgression are unfounded. There's nothing wrong with money. There's nothing wrong with making money. There's nothing wrong with business. There's nothing wrong with making art and selling art or writing books and selling books. There's nothing wrong with that. But you have to get to that point where you not just know that, but you actually don't feel the guilt and shame when
Mhm.
you engage in it. So a lot of people who are deconstructing their beliefs and trying to learn how to live in this world have to go through that season. And
Yeah.
for some people, it doesn't end. Yeah.
Yeah. When you talked about how you were graduating
Mm.
from the seminary and you had this moment of, I'm not sure the scriptures are inspired. I can't remember how you phrase it. How did that distill upon you as kind of like a thing?
Well, because up to that point, when I was a teenager, I studied the Bible. I had a youth leader who studied the Bible, taught me how to study the Bible. I had an interlinear Bible. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's a Bible that has several translations running together.
Oh.
I think it's like King James, the Living, and the NRSV and the Amplified
Mm,
versions all running together. The big, thick Bible, right? And I had pencil crayons and
mm,
colored pencils, and pens, and I still have it actually. It's quite a thing to look at because it's full of color and
mm.
full of writing in the
I
margins
have
and
a
everything.
that's how my missionary scriptures are. I'm totally right there with you. They look
Yeah.
like,
So
yeah.
I was like a total Bible fanatic. And then I went to Bible college. I got 2 years of Greek there, a year of Hebrew there. And
Mm,
then I went to seminary and I got more Greek. I took Greek every year to the point where I was speed reading New Testament Greek. I took more Hebrew. I took a year of Aramaic. I was studying under Dr. Gordon Fee, one of the world's most famous biblical scholars. And like I was on my way to become a biblical scholar. That was my goal. I even started my PhD in New Testament studies at the University of Toronto. But long story short, when I was graduating from my master's in New Testament studies, I was reading a book. I had some time. I was done all my papers. I finished all my exams. I already knew I was graduating cum laude, and I was just looking for stuff to do. And I found a book in a bookstore that looked interesting, and I picked it up and I bought it and I read it and it devastated me.
Hmm.
It was called
But
The
it called to
Silence.
you, like it found you. Do you feel like it found you
Yeah,
and called
it
you?
definitely
Yeah.
one of the most influential books in my life. So, and you're gonna get people asking, "What's the name of the book?" So I'm gonna tell you. It's James Breach, The Silence of Jesus,
Mm,
and he basically analyzes a few of the sayings of Jesus that he feels were authentic and that weren't put in his mouth by the writers of the gospels and so on. And he just sort of unfolds his argument, and it was like very convincing. And it wasn't that I stopped believing in the inspiration of scripture, it was just that the seed of doubt was planted and
mhm.
it was too late. It was too late, it couldn't be reversed. And it was in there. A few years later, ended up getting ordained, becoming a minister, and I served the church as a pastor for about 30 years, deconstructing the whole time I was serving
Wow.
pastor. Yeah.
That's fascinating. I'm always struck when I talk to different people who were, like they were on a certain trajectory
Yeah.
and their life was mapped out and they truly felt they were doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Which, right is a little more nuanced to us now, maybe as it was back then, but it was like black and white. You're either dedicating your entire service, your entire life to devotion, service, putting yourself second, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when you said inspiration of scripture, what came to my mind is it's so, like you said, Jesus taught in parables.
Mhm.
When you really look at the writings, I mean, I grew up with the King James Version, and I've also part of my deconstruction was finding the Gnostic texts. That's a whole other story. But even in the Gnostic texts and in the Apocrypha and in, let's just say, the King James Version of the Bible, Jesus is not disseminating what to do other than love. And when someone comes to him with a question, he reflects the question back to them and he teaches in layered parables. To me, the inspiration of scripture has become so muddied because people, let's just say, who are on an academic path, that we're supposed to look to them as the ones who know and how to interpret scripture. And then you have someone who's inspired, who maybe like they got their own download and then they disseminate it to their congregation and they all accept it as truth. When
Mhm.
it's I don't believe that any sacred texts are meant to be definitive. They're to meet that person where they are. Like you said, their gender, their race, their sexual orientation, whatever their life station is.
Mhm.
And I think that we've just had, like you said, that kind of that top-down approach of that hierarchical, like, I don't know enough, so I've got to ask somebody else how to interpret this for me. And we
Mhm.
lose the deeper meaning. We lose the essence of the teaching
Mhm.
because we're, think Pharisees and Sadducees. I was awake to this for a very long, I would say 20 years ago, I woke up to the whole Pharisee Sadducee thing. Like, why are there so many rules? Why is everything so down to didn't Jesus kind of like buck up against all of those rules? He didn't get baptized in the church. He got baptized in the wilderness. And whenever I'd ask questions like that, they're like, well, he put a church on the earth when he was here and he had apostles and teachers and evangelists and prophets. And so that's the order that we do it here. And I'm like, what church was that? Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, when you brought up the inspiration of scripture, it was like, I think that was my first portal into ask that it's okay to ask questions because I was always that person raising her hand and asking questions. And I was kind of shamed for that. And I was told to not look beyond the mark. I was told to pray and fast and whatever, but I was never allowed to have a question that bumped up against the existing doctrine.
Yeah, so with me, the whole, and you're alluding to it here and there, I think there's two kinds of deconstruction. One is from theology, and the other is from the church. So one's theological, the other's ecclesiological.
Mm,
And I started deconstructing ecclesiologically or theologically, where I started questioning, oh, is the Bible inspired? Because if it's not, everything I've hinged my beliefs on is questionable.
yeah.
So everything's questionable. It was the thin end of the wedge for me, and I knew it intuitively that this was going to be trouble. But then there's the other deconstruction ecclesiologically with the church, where I tried my best for many years to serve the church on the inside and do what I could to make it a better place, and realized at some point that with the help of the congregation I was serving, that my time inside the church was no longer going to work. I had to make a decision to stay or leave, and I chose to leave, not only for my best interest, but for the best interests of the church that I was a pastor of at the time. And so, for me, and this all converged around the same time when I had that mystical moment where I saw that we were all connected and one at a deep and
I love
fundamental
that.
level.
Love it. So you did like waking vision, or was it a dream or an
Yeah.
understanding?
It was waking. Yeah, it was awake, and it was kind of like, I'm not going to say it was a vision or a revelation or anything. It was just like kind of popped into my head. It was a beautiful experience. Yeah, nothing, no chemicals involved, nothing. It was just happened.
Yeah.
And, I started sharing that. That would happen in 2009, March of 2009. And in March of 2010, I left the ministry.
Why do you think it's a threat to the ecclesiastical organizations, the
Uh-huh.
clergy, the church, the idea of oneness? Why is that threatening? Why would they not want oneness?
Yeah, religion depends on exclusivity. A religion can only succeed if it believes it's the right one. That's embedded in the ideology and the mindset, the paradigm of a religion, is
Mhm.
that it's the right one.
What about within, like, just say any one religion? So I think you mentioned you were a Presbyterian minister. So let's just say with Presbyterianism, believing it's the one true church. What about the awakening within that religion to what we were just talking about around not wanting oneness inside just one religion? Like you're a pastor, you've had this mystical awakening, and you're trying to teach oneness, I'm assuming, in some way, shape, or form to your congregation, and there was that resistance that you were meeting that resistance. Why do you think that's so? Even within that congregation or within that construct of that religion?
Well, the congregation was one of arenas where I was starting to experience discomfort, but also online. I'd started my blog nakedpastor.com in 2005.
Mm,
And so in 2009, when I'd had this moment, I started sharing that naively.
mhm.
I think people are going to want to know. And I found it very liberating. And I thought other people would love to feel that feeling of liberation as well. And I was sharing it. And head office was getting letters of concern from people who would read my blog and saying, you have a fox in the vineyard, and, you have a heretic in one of your pulpits and stuff. And I started getting calls from head office, and I knew my time was up. And sure enough, it led to that. And it's because, like I said, a religion's presumption is that it's right. And then each of the denominations and the micro groups within it think they're the most right in a general sea
Yeah.
of their own religion. Yeah. So, of course, Presbyterian Reformed theology, based on Calvin and others, of course they are going to believe that their theology is the best one. It's just,
Yeah, it's
I
like you said.
understand that. That's okay. That's fine.
Yeah, yeah, but, like, what about the rest of the world population? What does that make them? These are the questions I always had, even
That's
from
the
the time I
question.
was little. I'm like, I did the math.
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, the theology was everyone needs to be baptized with the proper priesthood authority. Proper priesthood authority that's been restored to the earth through the latter day prophet Joseph Smith, and there's this whole priesthood line of authority. So I would always be like, well, how many members of the LDS church are there? Okay, well, right now there's about 16 or 17 million. And if you look at the entire world population, it's like 8 billion or something. And it was like less than one half of or 1/10 of 1% or something crazy like that. And by the way, like 2/3 of the LDS church right now are considered inactive. So that number is even less.
Mm.
But if you look at the straight math of all of God's children on the earth right now, needing to get a certain kind of authoritative baptism to be recognized by God, to accept a certain set of standards or lifestyle or, commandments or theological constructs or doctrines, the doctrine of
Mhm.
Christ is what they call it.
Mhm.
It's like less than 1/10 of 1% of the entire world. And I'm like,
Yeah.
and then they would say, well, in the next life, everyone's going to accept the same gospel. I don't know if you were told this too. Like, we're all going to become one, like Zion. This is where oneness went in my theological thing. Okay. So everyone's going to gather from all corners of the world. They're going to come together. They're going to be as one in Zion, and they're all going to believe the same thing because it's going to be so self evident. But it was, well, what are they going to believe? Well, they're going to believe that there's a hierarchy. And I'm like, well, if they're all one and then they're gonna still have a hierarchy, then how are we all one? It just these were the questions I already always had that I felt so bad for the people that didn't have the gospel. I felt so bad for them.
Well, I mean, I remember being taught that the number 144,000 of those who were gonna be saved on the last day was literal.
Yeah.
That's not very
Yeah,
many people.
I've heard that. I've heard that too. Well, if that's not very many people, you're God's super special favorite if you make
Yeah,
that
very,
cut.
very yeah, the competition is very high for those spots.
Yeah. So let me ask you something that I think about often.
Okay.
This might have happened to you. Definitely happened to me. When I started the initial stages of my deconstruction, I was 100% swirling in trauma.
Mhm,
And I mentioned to you on our call earlier before we started recording, it was a sense of betrayal trauma because there were certain things that I discovered in my earnest search for truth.
mhm,
Documents and narratives and different things were not what I was told. That there were certain key things that were left out of the narrative I was given and I was teaching for my whole life and all the things. Anyway, so I went into this real space of kind of closing in on myself and just it was just really not pretty. I was in fetal position for weeks and sobbing and reading and crying and going to source documents and going to public records and going, I wasn't following the naysayers. I was following my definite sense of I was following a trail
mhm,
that I know was inspired. I know that I was supposed to follow that trail and go down that rabbit hole. But then you would hear from other people like, well, I told you you'd be this miserable when you stepped away. I told you if you were listening to Satan and all they think like you seem so miserable now. See?
mhm, mhm,
And then of course that fueled my self-doubt. And then I would get to a point where like, okay, all right, probably being really selfish. I'm just gonna like quote unquote repent and then
mhm,
maybe I'll feel better if I come back in and just be with a group and just not go down with all my questions
mhm,
or what I've discovered.
mhm.
And I
Yep.
actually had a mystical experience when I got to the point where I was ready to do that. It's almost like I was taken to the edge to sort of see. And then how long can she go in the dark? How long can she go without capitulating and going back to the tribe and back to the community and all the old ways? It was my comfort zone. But yeah, I found that it wasn't my comfort zone anymore. I was so uncomfortable. And so I didn't fit anywhere. And it was just, anyway, I had this mystical experience, and Mary Magdalene's involved in that and what she represents archetypally and historically. And then I found the whole Gnostic Gospels, completely deconstructed Christianity, the historical all of it. And I didn't share with a lot of people because I felt like, number one, it was my sacred path. But then I started this podcast and I started bringing guests with all these diverse voices. And then the people that were telling me that I was going to be miserable if I stepped away
Mhm,
later came back and said, there's something different about you. I'm so sorry that I thought that. But there is definitely something you seem more peaceful. And that's after I had to write out all the trauma. Did you go through any kind of I'm laughing because I already know the answer. Were you having some pushback around like did you get things get worse for you when you stepped away from the ministry? Did you go into a hole? Did you go
yeah.
down a dark cave? Did you sit in a dark cave?
Yeah, like, can I ask you a question first? How
Sure.
long were you in that metaphorical fetal position, would you say?
I would say a solid week.
Oh. Oh, no,
And
I mean, like
then, oh, like metaphorically or
yeah, like the whole trauma
oh my
period.
goodness, 3 or 4 years on and off of just finding something else out and deconstructing that and going down like, "Oh, I would have made a different choice in my life if I'd known this," or, like I was telling you earlier, placing my daughter for adoption and getting disfellowshipped and being pressured to place her for like, every choice I made in my whole entire life was in through the lens of the worldview
Uh-huh,
of these certain doctrines.
yeah.
And my unworthiness and my need to capitulate, obey, and sacrifice to
Mhm.
those doctrines and to the hierarchy, to the prophet, really. So, to answer your question, it was I'd be doing really well, and then something else would take me down, and then I would have to work through that through my body. But I realized it wasn't just me, it was my ancestors, it was intergenerational trauma, it was
Mhm.
that persecution complex that we've talked about. It was the suffering, the persecution, the pioneering, the sackcloth and ashes, all of that.
Yeah. It's very much like, let's say, a woman leaving a narcissistic abuser husband. And they say, the husband says, "You're going to be so unhappy. You're going to be miserable. You're not going to have any money. You're not going to succeed. You're going to have no friends. And, you're going to be depressed." And they're kind of proven right for a while because the woman's life is so radically changed. She really has cut herself off from, she might not have a house. She doesn't have any finances. She doesn't have a career or a job. She's traumatized, and, his family and maybe her family reject her because she left him,
Yeah.
and, they're friends and all this kind of thing. But after a few years, she starts getting healed and walking out of the trauma, and suddenly she's aglow, she's happy, she's successful, she's got friends, she
Her
maybe
health
has a
improves.
boyfriend.
She comes
Yeah,
online. Mhm.
yeah, yeah. And it's like that when people deconstruct. People are proven right at first. They're like, see, I told you deconstruction is horrible. Look what's happening to you. But give them time. You watch, they're going to flourish. So my deconstruction started, like I said, way back in the 80s.
Mhm.
And then when I left the ministry in 2010 and we had to leave the church because it's a small town, small church, blah, blah, blah. That's when Lisa and I that's when things it was like the perfect storm, a convergence of stuff that we nearly lost our marriage, our mental health was out the window. It was very, very traumatic for a few years.
Yeah.
And like at one point, Lisa was studying to be a nurse. She was 48 years old and decided to go
Mm.
to university
That's
and
awesome.
got her nursing degree. She graduated when she was 52, and she's still a palliative care nurse to this day.
Mm.
But it was hard. We almost lost our marriage. We almost, it was just horrible,
Same,
horrible.
same with us. We
And
we actually separated that year.
yeah, well, Lisa left several times.
Well, and your
And
mental health does take, you're not yourself
yeah, no,
because
it's
who
it's
you were before,
it's insane. It really is. It's
it's like
insane.
you're trying to excavate who you are. And then
Yeah.
this is my best metaphor. So it was like I was in outer space and I was tethered to a mothership. I was an
Yes.
astronaut tethered to a mothership. And the mothership was, this is where we're all going, the good ship Zion or whatever. These are the things and the best way to be. And so I was tethered to that.
Hmm.
I was born into that.
Hmm.
And then I have these deconstruct, it's almost like of my own volition, I unplugged the tether and I went hurling into outer space. And I didn't know, I was so disoriented. I didn't
Yeah.
know what way was up or down or where I was. And I was spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning. It's like, how do I get back to that mothership? And my soul was like, girl, that's not your home anymore. You
Hmm.
know, and
Hmm.
anyway, that is my best metaphor because that is exactly what it felt like. And then I had other people saying, see what happened, like you said, see what
Yeah.
happens. And so my mental health, yeah, how could you not have mental health issues
Hmm.
if your entire paradigm, worldview, and construct of life in now and the hereafter completely upends? You're
Hmm.
going to have mental health issues. Did
Yeah.
you have a place where you could land? Did you have a tribe or did you find somebody that could anchor you?
Well, my wife looked at me one night and she said, "You need help." And she was right. And I found a therapist. I also found an online coach who happened to had also been in the Vineyard Church in ministry. And I also started an online community for people who are deconstructing called The Lasting Supper. And it's still going today.
Cool.
And yeah, so I had to find and build resources for myself. And now I feel my calling, if you want to call it that, is to
You know
provide
that word, right? You just like that word.
yeah, to provide resources and safe spaces for people to deconstruct. And
Mm,
that's what I'm about. That's what I do. I'm all about spiritual independence and helping people find their freedom and live their freedom. That's what I do. And it's worth it. It's really worth it.
yeah, I would hear people say that.
It's
I
going
would
to
hear
hurt.
people say, yeah, you can get on the other side of this and it's worth it. But I
Yeah.
couldn't, in my brain, I couldn't see how it could be and I could get better. I don't know if
Mhm.
you went through that too, but I
Yeah.
know you're a proponent of like, we're never done deconstructing. It's a never ending process, not just with like, let's just say religious constructs, but like everything,
Yeah.
government, academia, what we've been told about everything,
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
But religious deconstruction is its own animal because it has eternal ramifications that they're literally taking the hugest risk by answering, like you said, spiritual independence. I call it soul sovereignty. I don't remember how you phrase it, but like giving people their own, like it's okay to craft your own path. This is your journey.
Yeah.
It's just not something that we were ever encouraged to do. I now, when I see somebody that's starting deconstruction, I'm like celebrating that.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
a step towards spiritual maturation. Are you familiar with James Fowler's stages of faith?
Oh, yes, I talk about it all the time.
Yeah, and I love it too. How would you present that to somebody, let's just say, who was in that precipice place of, I don't know, I'm having questions?
So I used to, in the early days, think of spiritual growth as linear, grow kind of like age.
Mhm.
But that no longer sufficed because it's like you're leaving stuff behind, like a snail trail. Then I came across Fowler, his stages of faith, and where, you move from infancy, where you're completely dependent, to you become a child, where you learn how to be independent, and then you become, as an adolescent, you're independent, stubbornly, and then as an adult you become interdependent and so on. But I no longer like the stages either, because then you're looking down on yourself, your previous self, and on others who are at those stages.
Mm,
Now I think of spiritual growth as spatial, where you grow bigger to
mm,
include everything that went before. Nothing needs to be rejected.
mm.
Not your Mormon background,
Not too
not
far removed.
not my yeah, not my Presbyterian, Anglican, Vineyard, none of that stuff. I don't reject it. It's all a part of who I am. I always tell people you wouldn't be who you are now unless you were who you were then. And
Yeah,
so all that is a part of your story. Don't reject it. Don't be ashamed of it. Just part of psychological therapy is learning how to integrate all those
yeah.
parts of yourself, including the parts you're afraid of and ashamed of and scared of and all that. Learn how to integrate that into your life. That's how you become wise. That's
Oh,
how you become whole. Yeah. And so that to me is what growth is. And deconstruction, the big challenge I see for deconstruction is people not saying, well, I was duped, and, give it the finger and move on and reject everything. It's like, figure out, how did that help you to become who you are? You can't tear that chapter out
yeah.
of your story and you make sense anymore.
That's going to create more chasms of mental health
That's right.
issues. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah,
I love what you're saying. And I think the highest stage of James Fowler's is integration.
that's true. A
It's
sixth
just like,
integration.
and also on the hero's journey or the heroine's journey, the
Yes.
last stage is integrating. Like you
Yeah.
go through the you kill the dragons and you go on the quest and you get the elixir and you come back and you've integrated all of that depth and all of that descent. And it never stops, right? We're always on this continual hero's journey, which means we're going to go to the depths.
Yes.
We were taught to fear the dark, right? We were taught
Yes.
that there's no God there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And that anything to do with darkness was evil and demonic. So we have to face those parts of ourselves and learn how to integrate that,
Yeah.
not to bury it, dismiss it,
Mm.
press it, suppress it, all those things. We need to learn how to, even the parts of our past that where we were abused or whatever, we need to figure out how to integrate that stuff, not forget it. A lot of people go to therapy to try to remember their trauma, what caused their trauma, so that they can heal that. And that's the purpose of healing. It's healing means to be made whole. And so that doesn't mean cutting off those painful parts or those shameful parts. It means integrating those things. And so that's what I think is the big work of deconstruction.
Yes, absolutely. I want to just read this little part in your book while we wrap up that I really appreciated. It's
Yeah.
not this, I'm just going to hold this up. I don't people watching online. I just
Oh,
it's it's one man handing another man a box with a smiley face and he says, "Welcome to the faith. Now, here's our complimentary box, outside of which you should never ever think again." And underneath here, you've written, over time, I started getting more communications from concerned members suggesting that perhaps I wasn't really called to be a pastor anymore. Some were genuinely worried about me, that I was no longer happy, that I needed to find something else to do. And then you went on with sort of like them being alarmed at what you were thinking and feeling and asking. And that's kind of where I was leading to with Christ. He always reflected a question. And I
mhm,
think he was modeling that,
yeah,
but we don't always see that. We want the answers. It makes us feel better if we know everything, and I can tell you unequivocally that questions are not honored or held up as faithful when it comes to
mhm,
biblical perspectives or theology or, the doctrine.
yeah,
And so that was what I like to ask questions. I'm a very inquisitive person. And so for me, that was just a shutdown.
Mhm.
So I want you to just touch on one more thing before we close.
Okay.
And that is, you were recently challenged that there is no such thing as deconstruction, or that it's not valid, or it's not faithful, or it's not spiritual, or I don't remember how you put it, but it was in your newsletter. And I thought that your thoughts and feelings around that were really good, because you've actually been called out as,
Yes.
this is the guy to watch for. He's going to take you down a dark road in some circles. How would you respond to that? Now that you've had a little space around it, how do you frame that now when you get called out as a heretic or somebody who's leading people off the
Mhm.
quote path? You're leading people away from Christ. How would you respond to the deconstruction piece of that?
Well, the opening line in the book, it's in the foreword, says, "Apostasy is nothing new." And so as soon as I read that line, the opening line, I knew, okay, I know where this book is going. That's the taster. But what I say is deconstructionism isn't a thing. Deconstruction is a thing. I started using the word deconstruction. I borrowed it from a French philosopher, Jacques Derrida, who invented the word
Mm,
deconstruction to refer to questioning everything about the text, and that we can't know what the objective truth of a text is. There's too many obstacles to that. Not only my own paradigm, my own way of reading, my language, but also its transmission, the author's intent, and the words, and then the editing that went on. Their paradigms are so far and distant from our paradigms, it's impossible for us to understand what paradigm that was, et cetera, et cetera, et
yeah,
cetera.
yeah, yeah.
That's what deconstruction started as, questioning the text. For me, I borrowed it because it just sounded exactly what I was going through in my spiritual journey. And it's nothing new. Everybody, all through time, questions their beliefs. This is nothing new. It's not a
Mhm.
new thing. It's not a movement. Wait, there's no organization to it. There's no head, although there are people trying to, take the lead. There's no, what I mean? It's not professional. It's not organized. This is something that's always happened. People will always question their beliefs. It used to be, though, in the old days, you either shut up about it or got kicked out.
Mhm.
So now people don't care so much about belonging to a church. And COVID really exacerbated that, where people are like, you know what, I don't think I need the church. That's a new thing.
Yeah.
And that's a movement. It's a migration away from the church. It's huge.
Yeah.
But deconstruction isn't new. Doing it out loud is new. That's all.
That's true. Yes, yes,
You
yes.
used to get burned at the stake. Now you just go to a different
Well,
church, or
there
you stop going and, find new friends.
Yeah, I mean, now you could get disciplined by your church. You could get called in if you
Yeah,
were a dissenting voice or even raising a question that flied in the face of existing. Yep.
happened to you.
Yeah. Well, this has just been so great. And I really just want to honor your work and what you do and how brave it is, and how just the art itself is brilliant.
Thank
But
you.
I think people can feel your soul and your messaging. I will just tell you, you wanna know my favorite one is the one where of your cartoons is when people are drawing all the lines with the pencils. Jesus
Yes,
is coming
eraser.
behind trying to erase all of them, and he gets, like, the side eye from one guy, like, "What are you doing, Jesus?" Anyway, but it was soul food for me
That's great.
to sit with those, and that's why I got your book, and, I've shared your cartoons with different people and we just had a good laugh, and also, like, a good, like, "Oof, this hits the feels," like, this really gets to the heart of it, calls out some of the obvious
Yeah,
polarizing ideas of many religions. It's so self-evident now that
yeah,
if we're gonna push people to the margins and exclude and not bring every voice to the table, and like you said, that oneness, if we're not doing that, we're missing it.
yeah. Yeah, I agree 100%.
Well, where can people find your work, David? Where's the best place
Make
for them?
nakedpastor.com. That's where I'm at. That's home base. That's base camp. And I'm a Naked Pastor on all social media platforms. I'm everywhere. And I think that's one of the things that has helped me do well. And Naked Pastor gets out and around is because I'm on all the platforms and I just don't stop. And that's also what frustrates a lot of people.
Yeah.
I just keep
You're like, "I'm
putting out,
not going away."
I'm not going anywhere. I'm
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. Well, thank
So
you. It's brilliant. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Hey, it's Cherie here. Have you gotten my free whole body healing kit mini course? All you have to do is ask to join our private Facebook group, Soul Rose Community, and we'll send it right to your inbox. And I want you to know that I am so grateful for every single one of you who listens to these episodes. You can follow me on Instagram at cherie.burton to deepen into the discussion that you heard today. And I would be ever so grateful if you would leave this podcast a positive review on Apple Podcasts. This allows many more people to find these kinds of healing and empowerment gems that we bring forward in our discussions. And if you want to see our faces, check out my Soul Rose Show YouTube channel. Have a glorious week, and we'll talk to you next time on the Soul Rose Show.